Welcome to Life Stories, where we share powerful tales of resilience, betrayal, and redemption. Today, we bring you the incredible journey of Madison Marshall, a young girl wrongfully imprisoned for a crime she never committed, betrayed by those she trusted most. Madison's life was shattered in an instant. But her story doesn't end there. Join us as we follow her struggle for justice, the fight to clear her name, and the ultimate triumph of truth. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to start this unforgettable story today. The story begins with a man named Andrew Marshall, a figure revered not only for his immense success in business but for the integrity that formed the very backbone of his existence. Born into a humble family in a small, quiet town in the Midwest, Andrew had always understood the value of hard work. He had learned early in life that true wealth wasn't in material possessions but in the kindness you extended to others, and the way you could lift people up, even in the smallest of ways. Growing up, Andrew often found himself helping his neighbors, whether it was offering a hand to an elderly woman struggling with her garden or tutoring a young boy who struggled with his studies. His parents, despite their modest means, instilled in him the importance of compassion and determination. And so, with each passing year, Andrew became more resolute in his ambition, not to amass riches, but to create a life that could inspire those around him. In his early adulthood, Andrew left his small town to pursue a life in the bustling city. It wasn't long before he established himself as a businessman with a sharp mind and a heart of gold. He was respected not just for his shrewd business acumen but for his commitment to fairness, honesty, and integrity. Despite the temptations of wealth and power, Andrew never lost sight of the lessons he'd learned as a child. Even as his wealth grew, he kept his feet firmly grounded in the values he had cultivated throughout his youth. Andrew's reputation quickly spread, and as he navigated through difficult business negotiations, competitors and colleagues alike began to take note of his remarkable calm, his ability to see the human side of every transaction, and the genuine care he showed for the well-being of others. But for all his professional success, the treasure that Andrew valued most was his family, specifically his beloved daughter, Madison. Madison was the light of Andrew's life. Her birth had filled him with hope and promise for a future far beyond the challenges he had faced as a young man. She embodied everything he held dear: honesty, resilience, kindness. To Andrew, she wasn't just his daughter, she was the legacy he would leave behind. As he looked into her wide, innocent eyes, he envisioned a future where she would carry on the values he had spent his life cultivating, values of compassion, love, and selflessness. For years, Andrew worked tirelessly, not just for his business, but to ensure that Madison grew up in a world free of the hardships he had known. Together, they spent countless hours reading, talking about dreams, and exploring the wonders of life. Andrew was a devoted father, and every moment he spent with Madison reaffirmed his belief that the true meaning of success was the joy of family and community. It was during these blissful years that Andrew's path took an unexpected turn. One fateful evening, while attending a charity gala designed to raise funds for a community center, Andrew met Claire Bennett. She was a striking woman, elegant and poised, her presence commanding attention from everyone around her. But it wasn't just her beauty that captivated Andrew, it was the way she spoke about social causes, her passion for helping others, and her apparent kindness. To Andrew, Claire seemed like the perfect partner, someone who shared his vision of making the world a better place. Their conversations flowed effortlessly, their shared ideals creating a connection that felt almost fated. Over the course of several months, their friendship deepened. Andrew, a man who had always been cautious about trusting others, found himself drawn to Claire's charm and intellect. He began introducing her to the people he valued most, including Madison, who welcomed her with open arms. At first, Madison saw Claire as just another member of their extended family. The three of them often spent evenings together, sharing stories and discussing their dreams for the future. Madison was just a young girl then, full of innocence and trust. She saw in Claire a figure of protection, someone who could offer guidance and love in her father's stead. But as time passed, a subtle shift began to occur. Claire's admiration for Andrew's success wasn't just that of a partner or a friend. Beneath her polished exterior, Claire harbored a darker ambition. She grew increasingly captivated by the wealth and power that Andrew had worked so hard to build. At first, it seemed harmless, just innocent curiosity about business plans and philanthropic efforts. But with every question, every conversation, Claire's true intentions became clearer. She wasn't just interested in Andrew's ideals, she was interested in the empire he had created and the wealth that came with it. Andrew, blinded by his growing affection for Claire, failed to notice the subtle signs. To him, she was a reflection of the woman he had always dreamed of, someone who shared his passions and values. Yet as Claire's presence in their lives became more prominent, Madison began to sense something was wrong. There were moments, fleeting but undeniable, when Claire's interest in Andrew's business ventures seemed less about the good of the community and more about securing her place in his world. Madison, still young and innocent, didn't fully understand the danger that Claire posed, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Andrew, however, continued to trust Claire. Their relationship deepened, and she became an integral part of their family, with Madison coming to regard her as a second guardian. Little did Andrew know, the very woman he trusted most was silently plotting the destruction of everything he had worked so hard to build. The story of betrayal took an abrupt and horrifying turn one night when Andrew was brutally murdered. The light in his eyes, the warmth of his presence, and the strength of his character were extinguished in an act of violence so shocking that even the city, which had grown accustomed to such tragedies, found itself reeling. The worst part wasn't just the murder itself, it was the fact that the woman he had trusted, the woman he had welcomed into his life and the life of his daughter, was the one who orchestrated it. It began like any other evening. Andrew had spent the day attending meetings, giving his time to various charitable causes, and speaking with business associates. When night fell, he retreated to his study, a space where he often reflected on the day's events and jotted down his thoughts. This time, though, as he sat in his favorite chair by the window, lost in the comfort of his own company, Claire silently made her way through the house, preparing for the meal she had promised to prepare for him. But beneath her composed exterior, her mind was racing, plotting the culmination of months, perhaps even years, of careful manipulation. When Andrew confronted her that night, the conversation began calmly, even affectionately, but quickly, it escalated. Claire, the woman Andrew thought he knew, revealed her true colors, her ambition, her cold determination to claim the wealth and legacy that had always been his. When he refused to cooperate, when he questioned her, it became clear that Claire had no intention of letting him live to thwart her plans. The confrontation escalated into violence. Claire, with cold, calculated resolve, pulled a weapon from the folds of her dress and struck Andrew, silencing the man who had spent his life lifting others up. The betrayal was so profound that even the walls of the study seemed to mourn his loss, as if they could feel the depth of his soul's extinguishing. Andrew's death wasn't just the loss of a father and a philanthropist, it was the death of integrity. The end of a legacy that had taken decades to build. And then came the aftermath. A silence that hung in the air, thick and heavy. Claire, ever the actress, quickly shifted into the role of the grieving widow. She shed calculated tears, speaking of her deep sorrow and the void left by her husband's untimely death. But in the stillness of the night, when the cameras had stopped rolling, when the town believed her sorrow, her true nature reappeared. She began to weave her web of deceit. Claire's first move was subtle but powerful. She turned the blame onto Madison. The tragic death of Andrew, a respected figure in the community, was too much for the townspeople to process. They needed someone to blame. And Claire was ready with a story, a narrative designed to fit the pieces of the puzzle she had carefully crafted. She spun a tale of a petty argument, one about a teddy bear, between Madison and her father. This supposed dispute escalated into a deadly rage. She claimed Madison, in a fit of anger, had killed her father. The story was preposterous, of course. Madison had been nothing but a loving, devoted daughter. But Claire, with her performance so convincing, manipulated the situation to her advantage. She convinced the authorities, convinced the community, that Madison was the one responsible for her father's death. Evidence was fabricated, Testimonies were twisted, and soon, the legal machinery moved swiftly to condemn Madison for a crime she did not commit. Madison, barely 10 years old, found herself thrust into the cold and uncaring hands of the law. The trial was a blur of confusion and terror. In the courtroom, Madison sat there, too young to understand the intricacies of the case being presented against her. Yet fully aware that the people around her, her own community, had turned against her. How could they believe this? How could they think her capable of such violence? Her small frame seemed to shrink under the weight of the accusations. Her eyes filled with a mixture of terror and disbelief. How could they accuse her of taking the life of the only person who had ever truly loved her? The defense lawyers fought valiantly to bring the truth to light. But the overwhelming influence of Claire's carefully crafted narrative drowned out all reason. The trial moved swiftly, the evidence was manipulated, and the jury, swayed by Claire's persuasive testimony and the public's overwhelming belief in her sorrow, rendered a verdict that shattered Madison's life. The judge, guided by the supposed irrefutable evidence, sentenced her to life in prison. A child, sentenced to a future behind bars. For something she had never done. For Madison, the world was no longer a place of hope. It was a cold, cruel prison of lies and injustice. The walls that surrounded her in that courtroom were not just those of a building, they were the walls of despair. She was sentenced not just to life in prison, but to a lifetime of carrying the weight of a crime that was not hers to bear. It was a betrayal of the deepest kind. The world, which had once been full of laughter and love, now seemed like a distant memory, lost in the darkness of her wrongful conviction. The real tragedy, of course, was that no one saw through Claire's performance. No one saw the truth behind her fabricated story. The community, too lost in their grief for Andrew, failed to see the real villain standing before them. Prison was not just a physical confinement for Madison, it was an emotional and psychological battle. One that tested her very essence. At just 10 years old, her life had been turned upside down. The girl who once ran freely through fields with laughter in her heart now found herself trapped behind cold bars. Surrounded by silence and sorrow. The world she knew, once filled with love and hope, had disappeared, replaced by the harsh realities of a system that had wrongfully condemned her. The days bled together in a haze of confusion. The smell of concrete and metal became her constant companion. The sounds of clanging doors, muffled voices, and distant footsteps echoed in her ears. A cruel reminder of the isolation she now faced. Each day was the same, a relentless cycle of waiting, of wondering when, or if, the truth would ever come to light. In the sterile, impersonal space of the prison, Madison's innocence seemed to fade into the shadows, overshadowed by the cold walls that encased her. She often lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with memories of her father, Andrew's gentle smile, his kind words, and the security she had once felt in his embrace were now distant. Fading images. She clung to those memories with a fierce determination, trying to remember what it felt like to be loved, to be believed, but each day in prison chipped away at her sense of self, eroding the childlike innocence she had once carried so easily. Madison knew she was innocent. But she also knew that the world around her had been convinced of her guilt. There was no way to fight the weight of the evidence stacked against her. No way to break through the walls of the injustice that had imprisoned her. The trial had been a mockery of justice. A cruel farce orchestrated by Claire. But how could she prove her innocence when even those who should have protected her had turned away? How could a 10-year-old girl, without resources or support, challenge the narrative that had been carefully crafted to imprison her? Yet, despite the overwhelming despair that surrounded her, Madison's spirit did not break. Deep within the recesses of her heart, a small flicker of hope remained. It was fragile, delicate even, but it was there. She held on to the belief that one day, the truth would emerge, that one day, someone would see through the lies and uncover the real story. The love and lessons her father had instilled in her, lessons of kindness, honesty, and integrity, kept her going. Madison had no choice but to survive. She would not let the lies define her. She spent her days trying to make sense of her new reality. In the isolation of her cell, she read books, wrote in a tattered journal, and reflected on everything that had happened. Her thoughts were often clouded by sorrow and confusion. But as time passed, she began to piece together the puzzle of her life. She thought about the moments before the murder, the strange tension that had surrounded her father's relationship with Claire, the things she had noticed but didn't fully understand at the time. Over the years, whispers began to spread outside the prison walls. The community that had once condemned her started to question the narrative that had been accepted so easily. Those who had known Andrew, who had admired his character and integrity, began to wonder if there was more to the story. Slowly, doubts began to surface, like cracks in the foundation of a lie. But for Madison, it was not enough. The world on the outside was changing, but she was still trapped in a nightmare of her own. In the darkness of her cell, she sometimes allowed herself to dream. She dreamt of freedom, of the day when the truth would finally emerge and she would be free to live the life she had been denied. But those dreams were fragile, fleeting, often overshadowed by the reality of her situation. Each day, each hour, seemed like an eternity, but Madison clung to that hope. She knew she couldn't give up, not as long as there was even the slightest chance that the truth would come to light. Despite the isolation, Madison found small moments of solace in the connections she made with other inmates. They were women who, like her, had been victims of circumstances beyond their control. These fragile bonds, forged in the shared suffering of confinement, gave Madison the strength to keep going. They listened to her stories, whispered reassurances, and reminded her that she was not completely alone. As Madison sat quietly in the corner of her cell, reflecting on the years that had passed, she realized that the darkness that surrounded her couldn't extinguish the light her father had instilled in her. No matter how long it took, she was determined to uncover the truth and reclaim the life that had been stolen from her. She would survive this. She would fight. And one day, justice would prevail. The years dragged on, each one heavier than the last. But Madison never lost the spark of hope that had been kindled in her heart all those years ago. Despite the hopelessness that surrounded her, there was always the belief, however small, that one day the truth would break through the shadows of lies that had imprisoned her. She had lived through so much already: betrayal, wrongful conviction, and the isolation of prison, but it had not destroyed her. If anything, it had hardened her resolve, made her more determined than ever to uncover the truth and reclaim her father's legacy. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, whispers of doubt had started to grow. The community that had once believed Claire's carefully constructed story began to question the official narrative. People who had known Andrew and admired him for his generosity and unwavering moral compass began to wonder if something was wrong. They couldn't reconcile the loving father they had known with the image of a violent daughter who had taken his life. The cracks in the story were subtle at first, mere whispers among those who had loved Andrew. But as time passed, those whispers began to turn into a louder, more persistent murmur. In the quiet corners of the legal system, there were those who believed in justice, who could not accept that an innocent child had been condemned based on falsehoods. One such person was an independent investigator, a man who had been deeply affected by the story of Andrew's death and Madison's wrongful imprisonment. He had spent years working on cases that involved corruption, injustice, and cover-ups, and he had always believed in the power of truth. The case of Madison Marshall was no different. With a deep sense of conviction, the investigator began to re-examine every detail of Madison's case. He scoured old police reports, examined forensic records, and spoke to retired law enforcement officers. It didn't take long for him to uncover discrepancies, small but significant details that had been overlooked or deliberately concealed. Forensic tests on the weapon used in Andrew's death had been poorly conducted, with results that were inconclusive at best. The evidence that had been presented at trial was, at best, circumstantial and, at worst, fabricated. But the most damning discovery came when the investigator looked into the financial records of the Marshall estate. There, he found a series of communications, emails, letters, and meeting notes that painted a disturbing picture of Claire's intentions. Claire had been planning to take control of Andrew's wealth, to claim the life he had built for himself and his family. There was no longer any doubt in the investigator's mind. Claire had orchestrated Andrew's murder to seize his fortune. and she had framed Madison to cover her tracks. As the investigator pieced together the puzzle, he shared his findings with Madison's lawyer, who had long suspected that the conviction was unjust but had lacked the evidence to prove it. Together, they began to rebuild Madison's case, bringing the new evidence to light in the hope that the courts would reconsider her conviction. The tides of public opinion were shifting. Too. Journalists, social workers, and concerned citizens began to speak out about the inconsistencies in the case and the obvious flaws in the narrative that had been accepted so uncritically. As the investigation gained momentum, so did the pressure on the legal system. The more that was uncovered, the harder it became for those in power to ignore the truth. The community, once divided by grief and confusion, began to unite in their belief that Madison had been wrongfully imprisoned. The wheels of justice, once grinding slowly and without compassion, began to turn in Madison's favor. And so, after years of suffering, after years of being labeled a criminal for a crime she did not commit, Madison finally had a chance at redemption. The truth was coming to light, piece by piece, and with it came the promise of a future that had once seemed impossible. But the battle was far from over. The fight for justice was just beginning. And Madison knew that she would have to hold on to her resolve, just as she always had, to see it through to the end. As she waited in her cell, the weight of all the years she had lost still heavy in her heart, Madison allowed herself to believe that one day, she would walk free. The world outside had begun to change, and she would be part of that change. She would reclaim the life her father had built, and in doing so, she would honor his legacy, one of truth, compassion, and integrity. Justice was not just a dream. It was becoming a reality. And in that quiet, determined hope, Madison's journey toward freedom had begun anew. After years of isolation, of battling a wrongful conviction that should never have been, the day finally arrived when Madison was freed. The courtroom, once a place of despair, now stood as a beacon of hope. The carefully constructed lies had unraveled, and Claire's treachery was exposed for all to see. As the final gavel fell, the weight of the years lifted from Madison's shoulders. She had survived, she had fought, and in the end, justice had prevailed. Stepping out of the courthouse, Madison was greeted not with scorn, but with a warm embrace from the community that had once abandoned her. Those who had once believed in the false narrative now rallied around her, recognizing her for the innocent soul she had always been. The streets that had once seemed so alien, so distant from her, now felt like home again. As she walked into the world, the legacy of her father, Andrew Marshall, was once again in her hands. His wealth, his business, and the causes he had championed were now hers to carry forward. But more than that, she carried with her his spirit of compassion, his belief in justice, and his unwavering dedication to kindness. Madison knew that while the years in prison had stolen so much from her, they could never take away the values her father had instilled in her. With a renewed sense of purpose, Madison set out to continue her father's work, using the inheritance not for personal gain, but to serve those who were still in need. She knew the road ahead would be long, and the scars of her past would never fully fade. But she also knew that she had the strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Thank you for following Madison's journey. To hear more inspiring stories of triumph over adversity, don't forget to subscribe to the Life Stories channel for new videos.